Welcome. I am Dequitum, an armored fighter in non-choreographed night fights like these. Today we want to look at Matt Easton's statement of maces versus swords.
Now, is a mace easier to use than a sword? This is actually a point which has come under the comments under various of my videos recently.
This question also concerns my channel. Many people claim under my videos that maces, warhammers and axes are more effective than swords against armor. In his video, Matt Easton argues that maces are easier to use than swords only when it comes to armored combat. First of all, Matt Easton correctly states that in unarmored combat, a one-handed mace is significantly less effective than a sword. I think everyone agrees with that. If you don't know, check out his video. A few of the arguments he uses are so well made that they also apply to the area of armored combat. So let's take a look at some of them.
This is almost always a shorter weapon, and the thing, most axes are anyway, one-handed axes. Most maces are, even something like a baseball bat is shorter than most swords. So you've got less reach, you've got less hand protection, but moreover, really, with one of these, the only part of the weapon which you'll really do damage with, doesn't matter whether it's a mace or in fact something like a warhammer here, or whether it's some kind of axe, is the head. Now, when you're moving around and you're both trying to fight each other, that actually means you've got to be quite accurate with which part of the weapon hits the opponent, because yes, you'll hurt them if you hit them with this part of the weapon, but you're not really going to put them out of the fight. You're only going to put them out of the fight if you hit them with the head. Same thing with a hammer, same thing with an axe. So proportionately, you've only got about this much optimum hitting sort of region of the weapon, as opposed to a sword, where although you do have a center of percussion and the part where it's the most effective to hit them with, actually you can hit them with any part of the edge and both edges, or stab them with the point, and you're going to theoretically kill them or put them out of combat just with one good hit. One of these weapons, unless you get them in the head, yeah, you might wind them, you might break a rib, you might break a bone in their arm, but for the most part, you're probably not going to put them out of the fight unless you hit them in the head really hard with it. And that goes very often for things like warhammers and picks and things like that.
Yes, a mace is a shorter weapon. They have to be, because they hardly have any counterweight and otherwise can't strike fast enough. A shorter weapon is generally a disadvantage when it comes to gaining momentum through sweeping strikes. Especially in close combat, a mace often becomes a nearly useless weapon because your arm is hardly to use as a leverage to gain momentum. In full armored fighting, the swordblade is mainly used defensively in grappling as a protection against enemy attempts to pin the weapon. The only dangerous part of a sword is therefore the point, so also a small area, like the mace head. But the big difference between the tip of the sword and the head of the mace, however, is the angle of impact. The tip of the sword comes vertical towards the target, while a mace hits almost parallel and is therefore easier to parry than the tip of the sword, where timing is important when blocking. So even in armored combat, effective attacks with a mace are not that easy because they are easier to block than a sword. Last but not least, I completely agree with Matt Easton in his statement that maces are only dangerous for head hits. Striking to the arms, shoulders, or chest does not end a fight. Only head hits are normally fatal.
We've got to look at the context in which these weapons came about. Now, I'm going to deal with the most important for the medieval period, and that is armoured fighting. So when we're dealing with armoured fighting, we have a fundamental problem of how do you make your weapon effective against somebody who's wearing lots of armour. Fundamentally, an armoured opponent is not very easy to take out with a sword.
But not just with a mace either.
Okay, now let's briefly, very, very briefly, consider the ways that people in armour are taken out with swords. They are not predominantly taken out by hitting them really hard, because on something like this helmet or the arms and legs or torso armour of the 15th century, it doesn't really do anything, okay? It doesn't really do anything at all. If you're talking about sport combat, tournament fighting, then indeed they gave blows to helmets. Same thing in modern buhurt, for example, where people just hit each other really hard on the armour. It's fun, it's very athletic, somewhat scary, somewhat dangerous. It's quite hardcore, but it's not how you overcome an armoured opponent.
That's true, but if Matt already mentions buhurt, then we will use that to look at a few facts about maces in tournament sports like buhurt. Maces in buhurt have rounded edges, so they tend to slip more often on the armor of opponents and sometimes transmit less power. But the power itself of a buhurt mace should be comparable. First of all, maces are not anti-armor weapons. I don't know of any reports of people dying from being hit by a mace or that many knockouts with maces. Yes, indeed, the helmets of buhurt are often stronger and more padded, but the thickness of chest or arm armor are usually historical accurate. Even my historical shaped armor can protect me pretty well from mace attacks to my limbs or chest. In high-level buhurt tournaments, you usually see fewer maces than you would expect based on the opinions about maces on the internet. Most experienced buhurt fighters prefer to use falchions, stating that they can hit harder and are more reliable. Both weapons can have a similar weight in the striking area, but falchions have a higher hitting surface, like a sword, are often longer and have counterweight with the pommel for faster strikes. Above all, real falchions have a better tip for stabbing, and their cutting edge makes them harder to pin in wrestling. So it's no wonder that falchions are also seen more often than maces in historical battle paintings.
But it's not how you overcome an armoured opponent. How you overcome an armoured opponent is by wounding them in places where you can get through, between, behind, under the armour, okay? So in armoured fighting in the 15th century, we're mostly talking about half swording, we're mostly talking about wrestling distance, we're talking about trying to get the point into the armpit or the visor slit or the groin or the inside of the elbows, gaps essentially, or get the person on the ground where you can wrestle them and pull out a dagger and stab them again in a gap, or remove bits of their armour to stab into gaps. Okay, so bypassing the armour.
Matt, I completely agree with you. Of course, you can also stab an armoured opponent from a long guard and don't necessarily need a half sword. But this is actually difficult to master and requires a lot of practice to be able to use the range advantage over a mace by aiming to these small gaps of armor with a long sword from a long guard. Before we get into the fighting style with the mace in armored combat, we have to go back to the area of your video about unarmored use of maces, where you make an important point that I really like.
These were actually used, maces were actually used in a legal capacity, a law enforcement capacity in medieval countries and cities, specifically because they were less lethal than a sword. Because if you're a lawkeeper, an alderman or whatever, and you're patrolling the streets and you catch someone who's trying to pilfer some goods from a merchant. You chase after them, they try to put up a fight, and you hit them with your implement. If you hit them with a sword, you're probably going to kill them from blood loss or infection further down the line, all this kind of thing, even if you don't kill them in that second. Whereas you can hit them deliberately in the body or the arm or the leg with a mace, and you're going to put them down, you're going to arrest them, but they're not going to die. For this reason also, these weapons were supposedly preferred by churchmen over swords as well.
When it comes to armored fighters, I can also completely agree with you. Blows to the chest plate or the limbs under armor can hardly injure an opponent. With a good helmet, even a hit to the head will hardly result in the death of the fighter. However, a well-placed hit to the head would absolutely be able to knock out someone wearing a historical helmet. This would be very popular in many fights between knights, as a captured knight can bring a lot of ransom. Now we came back to your statement about the use of maces in armored combat.
However, in a military context where we're in close, we're fighting in armour, it's pell-mell, in that case the mace comes into its own. And here it is, here's the headline. In that situation, the mace is easier to use. Okay, let's just focus on that for a second. Why? Quite simply because using a sword in armour against another opponent with a sword is quite technical. You need to be very good on your feet, pretty good at wrestling, at least have a good solid grounding in wrestling, and you need to be very precise about what you're doing with your weapon. There's techniques in order to protect yourself from their sword and in order to get your sword point primarily, but also bashing with the pommel or hooking with the quillons, but primarily thrusting with the point into the gaps that it needs to go, and that's quite difficult.
What? If you only have a short mace, it's even harder to defend yourself than with a longer sword. Footwork is even more important when you have a shorter weapon, and wrestling also. You can use a sword as a dagger, but a mace needs space to strike hard. And didn't we learn that a mace is only effective against the head? With a warhammer this doesn't look much better. Hits to other weak points, such as hits to the armpits, can now also be useful, while a mace is only a little threat to the armpits. But even with a warhammer like this pole axe, it is not possible to penetrate deep through plate armor. If you hit hardened armor, in most cases it will hardly be dented, and if it breaks, you probably won't penetrate deeper than 1 centimeter. Here too, the only threatening area is the head, because only there can a hit at that depth be fatal. Matt, are you sure that it is easier to use a mace when you can only hit one area and your opponent knows that he only has to defend his head because the rest is under heavy armor? Inexperienced fighters in particular usually only know how to use a mace from one side and can therefore be even more predictable and easy to block. Even experienced fighters have a limited range of attacks with the mace or warhammer and are also more predictable than a swordsman. Only in battle it is less important to have an unpredictable attack pattern due to the chaotic scenarios that can happen. In an armored duel between two experienced knights, a mace was definitely more difficult to use effective. Fewer hit zones, shorter range, easier to pin in grapples, predictable attack patterns and easier to block. On the other hand, long swords are less complicated to use in half-sword than expected. Yes, there are a variety of techniques that can give you the advantage in specific situations, like for example the use of long swords as a lever in wrestling. But precise stabbing with the half sword is easy to learn. Even simply poking can be fatal.
If you know how to hit someone with a stick in a fight, you know how to use a mace because you just hit them really, really hard. And you can hit them in bits of joints of their armor to try and jam up and damage the joints of the armor, try and immobilize the armor.
Try that on a Gothic elbow. It will do absolutely nothing. Causing damage to the joints is a widespread myth and only rarely works. The armor on my shoulders are typical articulations. If I bend this plate, I can move my arms pretty well.
But additionally, just the bludgeoning effect, and even getting into maybe grappling as well and adding in grappling with the strikes. But even if you're fighting at distance.
First of all, strikes in close combat with a mace do nearly nothing. You can't get enough momentum to strike hard. And in range fights, you're constantly lacking reach. When I fight with a warhammer against half-swording, I'm usually busy running backwards because I need the perfect space for a good swing. A sword, on the other hand, can decide its fighting style and reaches from long guard to half-swording.
You can, of course, because you're wearing armour, if they're swinging something at you like a sword, if they happen to swing a sword stupidly in armour, you can literally just put your armour up in the way and give them a return strike with the mace. Just hit them really, really hard in the head, or the knee, or the the elbow, or the shoulder, places where you're going to have an effect on them through the armour, because this has such a top-heavy, a lot of momentum, a lot of energy transference through the plate.
You ask why you should swing a sword in armored combat? There are plenty of good reasons to swing a sword. Blocks, feints, preparing movements for thrusts, or simply striking to weak points like the gauntlets, or to gaps like the visor slit. And we haven't even mentioned the mortar to the head. Often it's the same reason why one strikes with a mace to target other than the head. Even though it only causes discomfort to the opponent or displaces his defense. Strikes to the shoulder or knees will not break the bone underneath. Yes, it may hurt, but you will be able to continue the fight. The difference to the striking power of a two-handed sword is often smaller than you would expect.
So, is it easier to use a mace than a sword? Fundamentally, no. They're both weapons that you use. Fighting is what you're using. However, I will say that specifically in armour, I would say that in armoured fighting, using a weapon like a mace, simply as a bludgeoning instrument, or we could say the warhammer, or even an axe, because you can have effect just striking with it, which pretty much everybody already knows how to do, especially if you've learned to fight out of armour, is easier than the technical and precise techniques of trying to use a sword in armour, because just striking with the sword won't do very much against armour. You have to really thrust into gaps, you have to wrestle to get to those gaps, and it's more technical and more complicated.
And this is where I have to disagree with you, Matt. Your statement sounds so simple, logic and obvious, but it is not thought through. I maintain that your fundamental statement is correct. But in a man-to-man armored fight, a knightly duel, a mace is much harder to use effectively. Poking and stabbing with a sword is not much more complicated than effective hitting with a mace. Yes, the techniques of mace combat are easy to learn, but not easy to use against a trained opponent. Then, thanks for watching, and thank you to Matt Easton from scholagladiatoria for his unwanted guest appearance on my channel. Thank you for allowing me to use your words to make my point. I hope I see you in the comments, or maybe on another video on this topic. Bye bye.